Mary's heart sank as the phone rang late that rainy night. She could never have imagined the devastating news on the other end. Her son, Ethan, her pride and joy, had been killed in a horrific car accident. The driver, James, had been drinking heavily before getting behind the wheel, his judgment clouded by recklessness. His car swerved wildly on the slick road before slamming into Ethan's with a force that left no chance for survival. Mary's world crumbled in an instant. She was consumed by shock, disbelief, and an unbearable pain that seemed to hollow her out from within. Meanwhile, James was handcuffed at the scene, trembling as the reality of his actions began to sink in. His hands shook, his breath ragged, as he realized the magnitude of the life he had taken. For Mary, the following days were a haze of sorrow, marked by sleepless nights and an endless flood of tears. She replayed Ethan's laughter in her mind, only to be jolted back to the cruel truth. For James, guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, even as he stood silently in court, unable to meet Mary's eyes. Both were trapped, Mary in her grief, James in his shame, two lives forever altered by a single devastating moment. In the months following the tragedy, Mary was caught in an endless cycle of grief and anger. Her home, once filled with Ethan's laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. She avoided Ethan's room, unable to face the reminders of his presence. Nights were the hardest. She would sit in the dark, clutching a photograph of her son, her tears falling silently as waves of anguish consumed her. She blamed James for destroying her life, but deep down, she also blamed herself for not protecting Ethan. The pain was relentless, and she withdrew from friends and family, building a wall of isolation around her broken heart. James, too, was a prisoner of his own guilt. In the confines of his cell, the echoes of that fateful night haunted him. He saw Ethan's face every time he closed his eyes, and the memory of Mary's devastated expression at the trial was a constant torment. His regret was all-consuming, but he felt powerless to undo the damage he had caused. Letters of apology he wrote to Mary remained unsent, crumpled and discarded, as he convinced himself he had no right to ask for forgiveness. For both Mary and James, the weight of their emotions became an unshakable burden. Mary's hatred for James grew stronger, even as her pain deepened her longing for peace. James, meanwhile, yearned for a chance to atone but feared that his remorse would never be enough. Their lives, though separate, were bound together by a shared tragedy, each struggling to find meaning in the aftermath of loss. After years of living in the shadow of her grief, Mary realized that her anger and bitterness had only deepened her pain. Despite the passage of time, she remained trapped, unable to move forward or reclaim the life she had lost. One evening, as she sifted through a box of Ethan's belongings, she came across a note he had written years ago. It read, "Mom, no matter what happens, always choose kindness." The words struck her deeply, igniting a spark of resolve. Mary decided she could no longer carry the heavy burden of hatred alone. She heard about a restorative justice program that allowed victims to meet offenders in a safe and structured setting. Though the idea terrified her, she felt it might be the only way to find closure. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, she contacted the program and requested a meeting with James. For James, the news of Mary's request filled him with both dread and hope. He had spent years imagining this moment, yet the thought of facing her made his hands tremble. He feared her anger but longed for the chance to express his sorrow and take responsibility for his actions. As the date of their meeting approached, both Mary and James prepared themselves for the confrontation, each uncertain of what would come but desperate to find some measure of peace. Their decision to meet marked the beginning of a new chapter, a step toward facing their shared pain, no longer as strangers divided by tragedy but as two human beings seeking healing and understanding. The day of the meeting arrived, heavy with emotion. Mary walked into the small, quiet room, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of her chair. Across from her sat James, his head bowed, avoiding her gaze. The air between them was thick with tension, as if the weight of their shared tragedy hung over them like a storm cloud. Mary's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and fear swirling within her. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, carrying years of bottled-up pain. "You took my son," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "You took everything from me." Her words were sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. James flinched but remained quiet, his own tears welling up. After a long pause, he finally looked up, his voice barely audible as he said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught Mary off guard. For the first time, she saw not the careless driver who had taken Ethan's life, but a man crushed by guilt and remorse. James began to speak hesitantly, describing the regret that haunted him every day. He admitted he had been too afraid to reach out, believing he didn't deserve forgiveness. "I know I can't bring him back," he said, his voice breaking. "But if I could trade places with him, I would." Mary listened, her emotions shifting between anger and a strange, unexpected empathy. She saw the pain in James's eyes, a reflection of her own. Though the wounds were far from healed, the encounter planted a small seed of understanding. By the end of their meeting, Mary's tears had softened. She left the room feeling both exhausted and strangely lighter, as though releasing her grief into words had begun to lift the unbearable weight she had carried for so long. For James, the meeting was a turning point. Though he knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, Mary's willingness to confront him gave him a glimmer of hope, a chance to start taking steps toward redemption. In the weeks following their meeting, Mary found herself reflecting on James's words. The anger that had consumed her for years began to waver, replaced by a quiet curiosity about what it might mean to truly forgive. She joined a support group for grieving parents and started sharing her story. Each time she spoke, the heavy burden she had carried seemed to lighten just a little. Through the support of others who understood her pain, Mary began to see forgiveness not as an excuse for James's actions but as a way to free herself from the chains of her grief. James, too, embarked on his own journey of atonement. Deeply moved by Mary's courage in confronting him, he started volunteering in programs that raised awareness about the dangers of drunk driving. Speaking to schools and community groups, he shared his story, hoping to prevent others from making the same devastating mistake. Though he still carried the weight of guilt, these efforts gave him a sense of purpose and a chance to turn his remorse into something meaningful. Over time, Mary and James crossed paths again. This time, it was at an event organized by a charity Mary had founded in Ethan's memory, a foundation dedicated to supporting families affected by drunk driving accidents. To Mary's surprise, James had become one of the most passionate volunteers, sharing his story to honor Ethan and to save others from similar pain. Their interactions, though initially awkward, grew into something unexpected, a mutual understanding. Mary saw how deeply James had committed himself to making amends, and James saw the strength it took for Mary to channel her pain into compassion. Though their wounds would never fully heal, they began to find solace in the shared goal of turning tragedy into a force for change. For Mary, the journey of healing was not linear. It was messy, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But each step toward forgiveness brought her closer to reclaiming the life Ethan would have wanted for her. For James, it was a path of continuous repentance, one that demanded humility and a willingness to face his past. Together, they proved that even in the shadow of tragedy, healing and redemption were possible. Years later, Mary stood before a room filled with families, survivors, and community members at a charity event for the foundation she had built in Ethan's memory. The once timid and broken woman had transformed into a beacon of hope. Her voice, steady and compassionate, carried the story of her journey through grief, anger, and finally forgiveness. "This foundation," she said, "is not just for Ethan but for all of us, to remind us that even in our darkest moments, we can choose love over hate, healing over despair." Among the crowd sat James, now a dedicated advocate for road safety and responsible choices. His presence at these events had become a symbol of accountability and transformation. He no longer shied away from his past but embraced it as a lesson to help others. When it was his turn to speak, he shared his experience of remorse and the profound impact Mary's forgiveness had on his life. Her strength, he said, his voice thick with emotion, saved me from being consumed by guilt. She taught me that redemption isn't given, it's earned every single day. Over time, Mary and James developed an unexpected partnership. Together, they worked tirelessly to expand the foundation, speaking at schools, churches, and community centers. Their story resonated deeply with people, illustrating that even the deepest wounds could lead to powerful change. For Mary, this new chapter of her life was a testament to Ethan's memory, a way to ensure that his legacy lived on, inspiring compassion and understanding in others. For James, it was a second chance to make his life meaningful, one he vowed never to take for granted. Their journey, marked by pain and loss, had led them to a place of renewal. In choosing to rise above tragedy, they had not only healed themselves but had also touched countless lives, proving that even in the face of unimaginable sorrow, the human spirit could find a way to rebuild and flourish.